Woman catches husband with dog. What she saw is shocking. Subscribe to the channel now and comment. Where are you watching from? Let's get to the story. Nathan Pearson had always found solace in the predictability of numbers. At 42, his angular face, with sharp cheekbones and deep-set blue eyes behind titanium-framed glasses, rarely displayed emotion beyond mild satisfaction when a complex algorithm yielded expected results. His salt and pepper hair was trimmed precisely every 3 weeks, no more, no less. And his wardrobe consisted mainly of crisp button-down shirts in neutral tones that required minimal decision-making each morning. The detached 2-story colonial in Portland's West Hills neighborhood was a testament to his methodical nature. Hardwood floors gleamed under precisely arranged furniture. The kitchen counters remained spotlessly clear except for a high-end coffee maker programmed to brew at exactly 6:15 a.m. Even the backyard featured geometrically perfect garden beds with native Oregon plants selected for optimal growth patterns. "Nathan, I brought home some fresh flowers from the farmer's market," Emily called out as she entered their immaculate home, her arms filled with vibrant dahlias and sunflowers. At 39, Emily Pearson was Nathan's opposite in many ways. Her curly auburn hair often escaped whatever attempt she made to contain it, and her wardrobe favored comfort and color over precision. Nathan barely looked up from his laptop. "That's nice. Just make sure they don't drop pollen on the dining table. I'm finalizing the quarterly trend analysis." Emily's smile faltered slightly. "I thought maybe we could have dinner on the patio tonight. It's beautiful outside. The forecast shows a 32% chance of precipitation after 7 p.m. Indoor dining would be more logical," he replied, fingers never pausing over his keyboard. Their interactions had settled into this pattern over their 12 years of marriage. Emily suggesting spontaneity, Nathan countering with logical alternatives. It was a dance they both knew well, though lately, Emily had begun to wonder if they were still dancing to the same music. Shadow, their imposing black German shepherd, rose from his spot near Nathan's desk and padded silently over to Emily. Unlike his master's distant demeanor, Shadow's deep brown eyes seemed to hold a profound understanding as he pressed his massive head against her leg. Emily crouched down, burying her fingers in his thick fur. "At least someone's happy to see me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Shadow's ears perked forward, and he licked her hand once before glancing back at Nathan with an intensity that sometimes unnerved Emily. The dog had been Nathan's impulse purchase. Ironically, one of the few spontaneous decisions he'd ever made after a home break-in 3 neighborhoods over. But from the moment Shadow had entered their lives as a gangly puppy, something unexpected had happened. The analytical man and the instinctual animal had formed a bond that seemed to transcend normal pet-owner relationships. "He needs his evening walk," Nathan announced without looking up, somehow sensing Shadow's movement despite his apparent focus on the screen. Emily stood, joints protesting slightly. "I'll take him. Could use some fresh air anyway." For the first time that evening, Nathan lifted his gaze, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Thank you. I should be done with this by the time you get back. Perhaps we could watch that documentary you mentioned, the one about marine ecosystems." It wasn't spontaneity, but it was an olive branch of sorts. Emily nodded, clipping Shadow's leash to his collar. As they stepped outside into the golden Oregon sunset, she couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow was watching her with unusual attentiveness, his powerful body staying closer to her side than typical. His protective instinct had always been strong, but lately, it seemed different, more focused, more alert, more worried. The next morning dawned with a fine mist hanging over Portland's tree-lined streets. Emily stood at the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a ceramic mug filled with chamomile tea. She'd been cutting back on caffeine lately, trying to address the persistent fatigue that had plagued her for weeks. Something about the gray light made her appear more fragile than usual, the delicate bones of her wrists prominent as she raised the mug to her lips. "You're up early," Nathan observed as he entered the kitchen, already dressed in a pressed navy shirt and khakis. His laptop bag hung from one shoulder, the weight of it as familiar to him as his own limbs. Emily nodded, not mentioning that she'd barely slept. "Thought I'd get a head start on the day." She didn't add that the dull ache in her right side had woken her before dawn, a pain she'd been dismissing as stress or perhaps the aftermath of a zealous yoga session. Shadow followed Nathan into the kitchen but broke from his usual pattern of staying near his master. Instead, the shepherd moved to Emily's side, pressing against her leg with unusual insistence. His dark eyes looked up at her face, then shifted to Nathan, then back to her. "He's been acting strange lately," Nathan commented, programming the coffee maker despite the half-full pot Emily had already brewed. "Perhaps we should schedule a vet appointment." Emily ran her hand over Shadow's head. "Maybe he's just picking up on something we're not." Nathan's eyebrows lifted slightly, the closest he generally came to outright skepticism. "Dogs don't have ESP, Emily. They respond to environmental stimuli and conditioning. Not everything can be explained by your data points, Nathan," Emily replied, a rare edge in her voice. The headache that had been building behind her temples intensified. Nathan paused, coffee mug halfway to his lips. "Are you feeling all right? You seem irritable." "I'm fine," she said automatically, though the increasing frequency of these moments, dizziness, fatigue, unexpected pain, had begun to concern her. But Nathan had been so absorbed in his latest project that she hesitated to worry him with what was probably nothing. Shadow whined softly, nudging her hand with his nose. "See? Even Shadow knows something's off," Nathan said, his analytical mind unable to ignore the pattern deviation. Emily set her mug down with more force than necessary. "For God's sake, Nathan, not everything is a data point to be analyzed. Sometimes people just have bad days." The silence that followed felt heavy, unfamiliar. They rarely argued. Disagreement was inefficient, as Nathan would say. "I'm sorry," Emily said finally. "I didn't sleep well." Nathan nodded, accepting the explanation with visible relief. "Perhaps you should see Dr. Keller. You haven't had a checkup in 13 months. "I'll think about it," she promised, knowing she probably wouldn't. The Morgan Foundation fundraiser was next week, and as their events coordinator, she couldn't afford downtime now. Nathan checked his watch, a sleek titanium timepiece that had been a 5th anniversary gift. "I have a morning meeting. Will you be home for dinner?" "Should be. Unless the committee meeting runs long," Emily replied, already mentally cataloging the tasks awaiting her at the foundation. Nathan hesitated, then did something unexpected. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her forehead gently. "Take it easy today if you can." The gesture, small as it was, brought unexpected tears to Emily's eyes. She blinked them away as Nathan grabbed his keys and headed for the garage. Shadow moved to follow him, then stopped, looking between Nathan and Emily with what almost seemed like confusion. "Go on," Emily encouraged, gesturing toward Nathan. But Shadow didn't move, his powerful body planting firmly by her side. "Shadow, come," Nathan called from the doorway, a hint of confusion in his voice. For the first time since they'd brought him home as a puppy, Shadow disobeyed a direct command from Nathan. The shepherd stayed beside Emily, his warm body pressed against her leg, dark eyes fixed on her face with unmistakable intent. "That's unusual," Nathan said, frowning. "Maybe he really does need that vet check." Emily nodded, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. As Nathan's car backed down the driveway, she sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly exhausted. Shadow immediately placed his head in her lap, those intelligent eyes never leaving her face. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. "What are you trying to tell me?" Shadow's only response was to press closer, his vigilance unwavering and somehow more frightening than the pain itself. The Morgan Foundation headquarters occupied a renovated warehouse in Portland's Pearl District, its exposed brick walls and reclaimed wood floors juxtaposed against sleek modern furnishings. Emily's office, tucked in a corner with windows overlooking the Willamette River, was uncharacteristically chaotic that afternoon. Binders of donor information splayed across her desk, colored sticky notes forming a haphazard mosaic on her computer monitor, and half-empty coffee cups creating a timeline of her day. "Emily, we need the final head count for the caterers by 4, called Diane, her assistant, from the doorway. Diane, a recent college graduate with boundless energy and an encyclopedic knowledge of Portland's event venues, paused when she saw Emily's pale face. "Are you okay? You look like you might pass out." Emily gripped the edge of her desk, waiting for the room to stop its subtle spinning. "Just stood up too quickly," she lied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The truth was more concerning. These dizzy spells had been increasing in both frequency and intensity over the past month. Maybe you should go home, Diane suggested, stepping into the office. I can handle the caterer calls. Emily shook her head, immediately regretting the movement. The fundraiser's in 5 days. I'll rest this weekend. Diane looked unconvinced but retreated to her desk. Emily sank back into her chair, pulling her phone from her purse. 3 missed calls from home. Frowning, she dialed their landline, something they maintained primarily because Nathan insisted on redundant communication systems. Mrs. Henderson, their twice-weekly housekeeper, answered on the second ring, her voice tight with stress. Emily, thank goodness. I've been trying to reach you. It's Shadow, something's wrong. Emily's heart lurched. What happened? Is he hurt? No, nothing like that. He's been pacing and whining at the front door since I arrived. I can't get him to settle down. He won't eat, and he barks every time I try to approach him. I think he wants out, but Nathan was very clear about not letting him outside alone. Emily checked her watch. Nearly 3. I'll come home. Give me 20 minutes. Hanging up, she gathered her essential files and made quick arrangements with Diane before heading to the parking garage. The drive home through Portland's afternoon traffic was tense, her mind cycling through possible explanations for Shadow's behavior. He'd never acted out with Mrs. Henderson before. Turning into their tree-lined street, Emily was surprised to see Shadow himself standing on their front lawn, his massive form impossible to mistake. Mrs. Henderson stood on the porch, clearly distressed, gesturing as Emily pulled into the driveway. I'm so sorry, the older woman called out as Emily exited her car. He bolted past me when I opened the door to water the plants. I couldn't catch him, but Shadow showed no interest in running further. The moment Emily stepped onto the driveway, he bounded toward her, circling her legs and whining in a way she'd never heard before. It's okay, Mrs. Henderson, Emily assured her, trying to calm the agitated dog. Would you mind finishing up inside? I'll handle Shadow. Once the housekeeper retreated indoors, Emily crouched to Shadow's level, wincing slightly at the twinge in her side. What's going on, boy? This isn't like you. Shadow pawed at her arm insistently, then moved a few steps away, looking back at her with clear expectation. You want me to follow you? She asked, feeling slightly ridiculous for expecting an answer. The shepherd barked once, sharply, then took a few more steps, looking back again. Intrigued despite her concern, Emily followed as Shadow led her along the side of the house to their backyard. He stopped at the garden bench where she often sat to read on summer evenings, jumping up to place his front paws on the wooden seat. Emily approached slowly, unsure what he was trying to communicate. When she reached the bench, Shadow dropped back to the ground and nudged her legs, as if urging her to sit. Okay, I'm sitting, she said, lowering herself onto the bench. The moment she did, Shadow placed his head in her lap, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. And then, with deliberate precision, he pressed his nose firmly against her right breast, exactly where the dull, persistent ache had been troubling her for weeks. Emily froze, a cold wave of realization washing over her. She'd read about this. Dogs detecting illness through their acute sense of smell, identifying cellular changes imperceptible to humans. Her hand moved unconsciously to the spot, feeling nothing unusual beneath her blouse. No, she whispered, more to herself than to Shadow. That's impossible. Shadow whined softly, pressing his nose to the same spot again, his message unmistakable. Tears filled Emily's eyes as the pieces suddenly aligned. The fatigue, the intermittent pain, Shadow's protective behavior. The shepherd had been trying to tell her something for weeks, and she'd missed every signal. Her hands trembling, Emily pulled out her phone and did something she rarely did during working hours. She called Nathan. His voice, clipped and professional, answered after 2 rings. Emily, is everything okay? I need you to come home, she said, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her chest. And I need you to help me make a doctor's appointment. Today. The uncharacteristic silence on Nathan's end said everything about how rarely she made such requests. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he finally replied, no questions asked. As she ended the call, Emily buried her face in Shadow's thick fur, allowing herself one moment of pure terror before squaring her shoulders. The dog remained perfectly still, his warmth a steady anchor against the sudden storm of uncertainty. Good boy, she whispered. Thank you for not giving up on me. The Portland Medical Center loomed before them, its glass and steel structure reflecting the gray afternoon sky. Nathan pulled into the parking garage with mechanical precision, finding a spot near the elevator bank just as Emily had expected. His hands gripped the steering wheel for a moment too long after he turned off the engine, betraying his otherwise calm exterior. "We're just being cautious," he said, not looking at her. "The probability of this being anything serious is statistically low for someone your age and with your family history." Emily recognized his retreat into numbers, Nathan's way of processing fear. "Statistics don't apply to individuals, Nathan. You've told me that yourself." His jaw tightened. "I know." They sat in silence for a moment before Nathan reached across the console to take her hand. His fingers were cool against hers, his grip firmer than usual. When he finally turned to look at her, the raw emotion in his eyes caught Emily off guard. "Whatever this is, we'll face it methodically," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "We'll gather data, consult experts, and formulate a plan." Emily squeezed his hand. "I know we will." The breast center waiting room was designed to be soothing. Soft mauve walls, abstract watercolors, plush chairs arranged in conversational groupings. Nathan automatically selected 2 seats with clear sightlines to both the reception desk and the inner door where nurses appeared to call patients. Always calculating, always planning for contingencies. "Would you like me to come in with you?" he asked as Emily filled out the medical history forms. She paused, pen hovering over the paper. In 12 years of marriage, Nathan had never accompanied her to a routine medical appointment. His offer touched her deeply. "Yes," she answered. "I would." Dr. Sarah Chun was younger than Emily had expected, with a direct gaze and a gentle but efficient manner. She listened carefully as Emily described her symptoms and Shadow's behavior, her expression neutral. "It's unusual but not unheard of," Dr. Chun commented when Emily finished explaining about Shadow. "Dogs have approximately 300 million olfactory receptors compared to our 6 million. Some research suggests they can detect biochemical changes associated with certain diseases." Nathan leaned forward. "What's the false positive rate for such detections? Has there been statistically significant research?" Dr. Chin smiled slightly. "There are ongoing studies, but the data is still preliminary. However, the symptoms your wife describes are worth investigating regardless." The examination was thorough, clinical, but compassionate. When Dr. Chin's fingers paused during the breast exam, her expression shifting subtly, Emily knew before a word was spoken. Nathan, watching from a chair in the corner, must have detected it too. She heard his sharp intake of breath. "There's a distinct mass in the right breast," Dr. Chen said, her professional tone softened with care. "About 2 centimeters, firm, irregular borders." The room seemed to tilt slightly, Dr. Chin's voice becoming distant as she explained the next steps. "Mammogram, ultrasound, possible biopsy." "What's the probability that it's malignant?" Nathan asked, his voice unnaturally tight. Dr. Chun met his gaze steadily. "I can't give you an accurate percentage without imaging and pathology. But given the presentation and your wife's symptoms, we need to move quickly to rule out cancer." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp-edged. Cancer. Emily had expected it, had prepared herself to hear it since the moment in the garden with Shadow, but the reality still struck like a physical blow. "How quickly can we schedule the additional tests?" Emily asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I've cleared my afternoon," Dr. Chin replied. "We'll do the mammogram and ultrasound today. If indicated, we can perform a needle biopsy immediately." Nathan stood abruptly. That's very efficient. Thank you." The hours that followed passed in a blur of cold examination tables, gentle technicians, and the steady rhythm of medical machinery. Nathan remained beside her throughout, his face becoming more tightly controlled with each procedure. He asked incisive questions about sensitivity rates, false positives, and treatment protocols, the statistician seeking solace in data. It was nearly evening when they finally sat across from Dr. Chun in her office, the day's test results displayed on her computer screen. Outside the window, Portland's early evening traffic flowed in rivers of headlights, people heading home to normal, unaltered lives. "The imaging confirms a mass consistent with early-stage breast cancer," Dr. Chin said, turning the screen to show them the shadowy evidence. "The needle biopsy results won't be back for a few days, but given the presentation, I believe we should discuss next steps under the assumption of malignancy." Emily felt Nathan's hand find hers, gripping with almost painful intensity. "What are those next steps?" Emily asked, focusing on Dr. Chen's face rather than the ominous shadow on the screen. As the doctor outlined surgical options, radiation, possible chemotherapy, Emily found herself thinking not of the treatments, but of Shadow, his dark eyes, his persistent warning, his unwavering vigilance. Had he somehow known all along, understood something fundamental that humans, with all their technology and intelligence, had missed? "I want to schedule the surgery as soon as possible," Emily said when Dr. Chen finished. "And then I want to go home to our dog." Nathan looked at her with surprise, then sudden understanding. "Yes," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. Shadow's waiting. The drive home from Portland Medical Center crawled through rush hour traffic, each red light an eternity of suspended animation. Nathan drove with unusual caution, his eyes frequently darting to Emily in the passenger seat. The space between them vibrated with unspoken thoughts, both trying to process the seismic shift in their reality. "I should call my parents," Emily finally said, breaking the silence as they crossed the Willamette River. The lights of downtown Portland reflected in the dark water below, a constellation of ordinary lives continuing their predictable orbits. "And the foundation. Diane can take over the fundraiser." Nathan nodded, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "Logical first steps. I'll contact my team tomorrow, arrange for remote work for the next few weeks." His voice maintained its usual measured tone, but Emily noticed the slight tremor in his hands. "Nathan," she said softly, "you don't have to be so controlled right now. It's okay to be scared." "I'm terrified." His jaw clenched. "Fear is inefficient. We need clear minds to optimize your treatment plan." "This isn't a data problem to solve," Emily responded, a rare flash of anger coloring her words. "This is life, messy, unpredictable life." Nathan pulled into their driveway, shifting the car into park with precise movements. But instead of exiting, he sat motionless, staring straight ahead at their perfectly maintained home. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its analytical edge. "I don't know how to do this, Emily," he whispered. "I don't know how to face the possibility of losing you. There's no algorithm for that." The raw vulnerability in his admission broke something open between them. Emily reached across the console, taking his face in her hands, turning him toward her. His eyes, usually so controlled and certain, were swimming with fear. "Then we'll figure it out together," she promised. "One day at a time." The moment they opened the front door, Shadow was there, his powerful body quivering with anticipation. He approached Emily slowly, sniffing carefully at her clothes and hands, as if searching for information about where she'd been. Then, with deliberate gentleness, he pressed his head against her legs. "He knows," Nathan said quietly, watching the interaction with new understanding. "Somehow, he actually knows." Emily knelt, wrapping her arms around Shadow's thick neck. "You tried to tell us, didn't you, boy? And we weren't listening." That night, breaking years of household rules, Shadow slept in their bedroom, not on his customary dog bed in the corner of Nathan's home office, but directly beside Emily, his massive body a living barricade between her and the bedroom door. Nathan, lying awake in the darkness, watched the steady rise and fall of Shadow's breathing, synchronized perfectly with Emily's. "I've been researching canine cancer detection," he said softly, unsure if Emily was still awake. "There are documented cases dating back decades. Some dogs have accuracy rates exceeding 95% for certain cancers." Emily turned toward him, her face pale in the moonlight filtering through their bedroom blinds. "Of course you've been researching," she said, but her tone held affection rather than criticism. "What else have you found?" "That I've been wrong," Nathan replied, his voice catching. "About animals, about instinct. Maybe about a lot of things." Emily reached across the space between them, her fingers finding his in the darkness. "I think we've both missed some important signals." Shadow lifted his head at their voices, eyes gleaming in the dim light, before settling back into his protective position. In the days that followed, as they waited for the final biopsy results, Emily observed a subtle shift in Nathan. He still methodically documented everything, creating spreadsheets of treatment options, survival rates, and recovery protocols. But something fundamental had changed in his approach. He began leaving work early, accompanying Emily to preliminary appointments with specialists, asking questions not just about statistical outcomes, but about quality of life, emotional support, holistic approaches. And most telling of all, he developed a new relationship with Shadow. The man who had always viewed the shepherd primarily as a security measure began sitting on the floor beside him, sometimes just talking softly about his fears while Shadow listened with those knowing, intelligent eyes. Emily found them like this one evening. Nathan cross-legged on the living room carpet, Shadow's head resting in his lap. Her husband looked up, embarrassment briefly crossing his features. "I was just telling Shadow about the surgical options Dr. Chen outlined," he explained. "Lumpectomy versus mastectomy, the recovery implications, radiation protocols." Emily smiled, joining them on the floor despite the protest from her increasingly sore body. "And what does Shadow think I should do?" Nathan's hand stilled in the dog's fur. "He thinks," he began, then paused, swallowing hard. "He thinks we should trust the doctors, but also trust ourselves. And him. He'll be with us every step of the way." Emily leaned against Nathan's shoulder, Shadow adjusting to maintain contact with both of them. "When did you become the intuitive one in this relationship?" "I'm learning," Nathan whispered, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I should have started sooner." The morning of Emily's surgery dawned with uncharacteristic sunshine for Portland in early spring. Golden lights streaming through the kitchen windows as Nathan meticulously prepared a light breakfast according to the pre-surgical instructions. His movements were precise but gentler than usual, a new awareness in how he placed the tea mug near Emily's hand, how he cut the allowed toast into perfect triangles. "The surgery is scheduled for 10:30 a.m., he recited, though they both knew the timeline by heart. "Expected duration is 2 to 3 hours for the lumpectomy and sentinel lymph node removal. You'll be in recovery for approximately 90 minutes afterward." Emily nodded, picking at her toast without appetite. "And then we wait for pathology." Shadow lay at her feet, his body pressed against her legs. Since the diagnosis, he had rarely left her side, his vigilance unwavering. The night before, Emily had found Nathan reading research papers on canine sensory perception. "Did you know," he'd told her, his voice filled with wonder rather than his usual clinical detachment, "that dogs can detect chemical changes in human breath that correspond to specific cellular mutations? They're essentially processing molecular data we can't even perceive." Now, as they prepared to leave for the hospital, Nathan crouched beside Shadow. "We have to go now, boy. You need to stay home today." Shadow's ears flattened, his body tensing with clear disagreement. "Mrs. Henderson will be here in an hour," Nathan continued, as if the dog could understand every word. "She'll check on you, take you for your walk. We'll be back tomorrow." Emily watched this one-sided conversation with tears threatening. "He's scared," she whispered. "He doesn't want me to go without him." "I know," Nathan replied, surprising her. "I'm terrified too." Mrs. Henderson arrived early, her kind face creased with concern. "Don't you worry about a thing here," she assured them. "Shadow and I will manage just fine." But as they spoke, Shadow paced anxiously between Emily and the door, whining softly. When the moment finally came to leave, Emily knelt painfully to hug Shadow one last time. "Be good," she whispered into his fur. "I'll be back before you know it." Nathan had to physically guide Shadow away, handing his collar to Mrs. Henderson as they stepped outside. The sound of the dog's desperate barking followed them down the driveway. The hospital was a maze of fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells. In the pre-op area, a nurse with gentle hands and tired eyes inserted in 4 while explaining each step. Nathan stood nearby, his tablet open to a document where he logged every detail: medications, dosages, names of the surgical team members. "Mr. Pearson," the nurse said kindly, "perhaps you could hold your wife's hand instead? The tablet will be there later." Something shifted in Nathan's expression. Without a word, he set the device aside and moved to Emily's bedside, taking her hand in both of his. "I'm right here," he said, his voice thick. "I'll be here the whole time." When they wheeled Emily toward the operating room, Nathan walked alongside until the last possible moment. At the double doors where he could go no further, he bent to kiss her forehead. "I love you," he said simply, more than any equation could express. The waiting room became Nathan's personal purgatory, a liminal space where time stretched and contracted unpredictably. He alternated between pacing the perimeter and sitting rigidly in uncomfortable chairs, checking his watch compulsively despite the large wall clock directly in his line of sight. At the 2-hour mark, his phone rang. Mrs. Henderson's name flashed on the screen. "Is everything all right?" he asked immediately. Her voice came through, strained with obvious distress. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Pearson. It's Shadow. I don't know how he did it, but he's gone. I took him for his walk, and somehow, he just bolted, pulled the leash right out of my hand. I've been searching the neighborhood, but there's no sign of him." Nathan closed his eyes, a new weight settling on his already burdened shoulders. "It's not your fault, Mrs. Henderson. Shadow has been different since Emily's diagnosis. Should I call animal control? The shelters?" "No," Nathan decided after a moment's thought. "Shadow is microchipped. If someone finds him, they'll contact us. For now, please just stay at the house in case he returns." Another hour passed in anxious waiting before the surgeon appeared, still wearing her cap, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Pearson?" "The surgery went as expected. We removed the tumor and 3 sentinel lymph nodes. Your wife is in recovery now." "And the margins?" Nathan asked, the oncological term now part of his everyday vocabulary. "Were you able to get clean margins?" "We won't know until pathology reviews the tissue," the surgeon replied. "But visually, it looked good. We'll have preliminary results tomorrow, with full pathology in a few days." Nathan nodded, processing this information with his typical analytical approach. "When can I see her?" "She's still quite groggy, but you can come back in about 30 minutes. A nurse will get you." Left alone again, Nathan found himself thinking not of statistical outcomes or treatment protocols, but of Shadow. Where had he gone? Why had he run? For the first time in their years together, Nathan wished he could communicate directly with the animal whose instincts had proven so much more perceptive than his own human reasoning. When finally allowed into the recovery area, Nathan barely recognized his wife amidst the beeping monitors and 4 lines. Emily's face was pale, her vibrant energy dimmed by anesthesia and pain. He took her hand gently, mindful of the 4 catheter. "Shadow," she murmured, eyes still closed. "He's at home," Nathan replied automatically, unwilling to worry her with the truth. Emily's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but insistent. "No, Shadow, here." Nathan frowned, attributing her confusion to post-anesthetic delirium. "Rest now," he soothed. Everything went well. Emily's fingers tightened weakly around his. "Look," she whispered. Following her gaze toward the recovery room door, Nathan froze in disbelief. There, somehow having navigated Portland's streets, hospital security, and medical corridors, sat Shadow, his black fur matted with mud, his powerful body trembling with exhaustion, but his eyes fixed unwaveringly on Emily. And standing beside him, looking equally stunned, was a hospital security guard. "Sir," the guard began, "is this your dog?" He was sitting outside the surgical floor entrance. Wouldn't let anyone near him except the head nurse. She recognized your wife's name from his ID tag. The next 48 hours unfolded in a blur of hospital bureaucracy, medical consultations, and unprecedented exceptions to policy. Nathan, who had once lived his life by rigid adherence to rules and regulations, found himself arguing passionately for something no rational hospital administrator would consider: allowing a German shepherd to remain with his wife during her recovery. "I understand your concerns about hygiene and liability," Nathan explained to Dr. Melissa Rivera, the hospital's chief administrator, his voice measured but determined. His normally pristine appearance had given way to rumpled clothes and stubble, physical evidence of his evolving priorities. "But this dog detected my wife's cancer before any medical professional. His presence demonstrably reduces her anxiety, which medical literature clearly correlates with improved recovery outcomes." Dr. Rivera studied Nathan over her reading glasses, then glanced at the substantial file he'd compiled overnight: research papers on animal-assisted therapy, precedents from other medical facilities, even a hastily obtained letter from their veterinarian attesting to Shadow's perfect health and temperament. "Mr. Pearson," she said finally, "in 20 years of hospital administration, this is perhaps the most thoroughly documented request for policy exception I've ever received." A small smile softened her professional demeanor. "Given the extraordinary circumstances, we'll allow supervised visits in a designated area. 2 hours, twice daily." Nathan exhaled slowly. "Thank you. You're making a rational decision based on the evidence. Actually, Dr. Rivera replied, gathering the papers, I'm making a human decision. I saw how your wife responded when that dog somehow found her yesterday. Sometimes medicine needs to recognize what science can't yet fully explain. Emily's hospital room transformed into an oasis of healing that defied conventional clinical settings. Nurses who initially expressed skepticism about a 95-pound German Shepherd in their ward soon found themselves looking forward to Shadow's visits, noting the marked improvement in Emily's vital signs when he was present. His body temperature runs about 101.5 degrees, explained Nurse Jackson, a burly man with tattoos visible beneath his scrubs, as he helped position Shadow carefully alongside Emily's uninjured side. Acts like a perfect heating pad for post-surgical pain. Emily smiled weakly, her hand buried in Shadow's fur. He knows exactly where it hurts, she murmured. And we're not to touch. Nathan observed this interaction from his chair beside the bed, where he'd been stationed almost continuously since the surgery. His laptop remained closed, his phone checked only periodically. The data analyst who once tracked every minute of his day now measured time only by Emily's pain medication schedule and Shadow's visiting hours. On the third morning after surgery, Dr. Chun entered with the preliminary pathology report. Nathan immediately straightened, his analytical mind snapping to full attention as he reached for Emily's hand. The margins are clean, Dr. Chin announced without preamble, knowing this couple preferred directness to gentle buildups. No evidence of cancer cells at the surgical borders. And even better news, the sentinel lymph nodes show no sign of metastasis. Emily's grip tightened on Nathan's hand. That's good, she whispered. That's very good, right? It's excellent, Dr. Chin confirmed. Based on these results, you're likely stage 1. We'll need to follow up with radiation therapy as a precaution, but this is the outcome we hoped for. Shadow, who had been lying quietly beside Emily, lifted his head at the change in emotion in the room. His dark eyes moved from Dr. Chun to Emily to Nathan, as if assessing each of their reactions. He understands, Emily said softly, stroking the dog's head. I swear he understands every word. Dr. Chin smiled. The nurses have been talking about your remarkable dog. There's growing interest in formal studies on canine cancer detection. With your permission, I'd like to connect you with a research team at Oregon Health Sciences University. Nathan looked at Shadow with new respect. The implications could be significant. Early detection is statistically the most important factor in survival rates. Always the analyst. Emily teased gently, but her eyes held fondness rather than criticism. Not always anymore, Nathan replied, surprising her. Sometimes I'm just grateful. 5 days after surgery, Emily was cleared to return home. Nathan had spent the preceding day preparing their house with the same attention to detail he once reserved for quarterly financial analyses. He installed a specialized bed wedge to help Emily sleep comfortably, reorganized the kitchen so essential items were within easy reach, and programmed his phone with medication reminders. Mrs. Henderson had stocked their refrigerator with homemade soups and casseroles, cleaning the house to an even higher standard than usual. I've been so worried about both of you, she confessed as she helped Nathan arrange pillows on the living room sofa. And Shadow hasn't been the same since Emily left. He barely eats. As if summoned by his name, Shadow appeared in the doorway, his ears perked forward. For days, he had divided his time between hospital visits and anxious pacing at home, refusing to settle into his usual routines without Emily. She's coming home today, boy, Nathan told him, realizing he no longer felt self-conscious talking to the dog as if he were human. Just a few more hours. When they finally pulled into the driveway that afternoon, Shadow was waiting at the front window, his silhouette visible through the curtains. The moment Nathan helped Emily from the car, the front door opened. Mrs. Henderson had left it slightly ajar, and Shadow bounded down the steps with surprising gentleness, coming to an abrupt halt directly in front of Emily. Hello, my guardian, Emily said softly, carefully kneeling to embrace him despite the pull of her surgical sight. I missed you too. That night, with Emily settled in their bed surrounded by pillows, Nathan sat on the edge of the mattress reviewing her medication schedule one final time. Shadow lay on the floor beside Emily's side of the bed, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes alert. You know, Nathan said, setting aside the medication chart, I've been thinking about what Dr. Chen said. about the research studies on canine cancer detection. Emily looked up from the novel she'd been trying to focus on. What about them? Maybe we should get involved. Shadow's abilities could help others. He reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. He saved your life, Emily. He knew something was wrong before either of us had a clue. Emily studied her husband's face, noting the softness that had replaced his usual analytical expression when he looked at Shadow. You've changed, she observed quietly. Cancer changes everyone it touches, Nathan replied. Not just the cancer, Emily clarified. You're different with him now. She gestured toward Shadow. With both of us. Nathan was silent for a long moment, his hand continuing its gentle rhythm in Shadow's fur. I've spent my life believing in systems, in rational analysis, in the superiority of human intellect, he finally said. And then this dog, this creature operating purely on instinct and loyalty, saw something I missed completely. Something that could have cost me everything. His voice caught. Some things can't be calculated, Emily. Some things just have to be felt. Shadow rose then, moving to place his head directly under Nathan's hand, his dark eyes fixed on the man's face with unmistakable understanding. 6 weeks after surgery, Emily stood at the kitchen window watching spring unfold across their backyard. The Japanese maple they'd planted on their 5th anniversary had erupted in crimson leaves, and pots of cheerful pansies lined the patio. Nathan's surprise, arranged while she was at a radiation appointment. Her right side still ached from the treatments, but each day brought incremental improvement, small victories to be celebrated. Your tea, Nathan said, placing a steaming mug beside her. He'd become an expert in herbal blends that helped with radiation fatigue, researching them with the same meticulous attention he once reserved for market trends. Thanks. Emily smiled, leaning slightly against him as Shadow padded into the kitchen to complete their trio. What's on the agenda today? Nathan consulted his phone. Your radiation session at 11. Lunch with your parents at 1:30. And he hesitated, a hint of excitement breaking through his composed exterior. The researchers from OHSU are coming at 4 to meet Shadow. The research team, headed by Dr. Elaine Markson, an oncologist with a special interest in early detection methods, had been eager to evaluate Shadow since hearing about his remarkable behavior. Today would be their first formal assessment. Do you think he'll perform on command? Emily asked, watching Shadow as he settled into his favorite spot near the kitchen island, eyes never leaving her. It's not exactly a trainable skill. Dr. Markson said they'll start with basic scent discrimination tests. They've had success with other detection dogs using similar protocols. Nathan's enthusiasm for the project had surprised them both. The man who once viewed Shadow as merely a practical security measure now spoke about canine cognition and scent detection with passionate intensity. Emily's radiation appointment passed like the others. 40 minutes of precise discomfort followed by crushing fatigue. Nathan drove her home afterward, his eyes frequently checking the rearview mirror where Shadow sat attentively in the back seat. They had received special permission to bring him to her treatments after the hospital staff witnessed his extraordinary behavior. You should rest before your parents arrive, Nathan suggested as they entered the house. Emily nodded, too tired to argue, though a small part of her resented these moments of weakness. At the foundation, Diane had taken over the fundraiser planning with impressive efficiency, but Emily missed her work, missed feeling capable and strong. As if sensing her thoughts, Shadow pressed against her leg, guiding her toward the living room sofa. Nathan watched, still marveling at the dog's intuitive understanding. Just a short nap, Emily conceded, settling carefully against the cushions. Shadow immediately took his position beside the sofa, his body parallel to hers like a living guardrail. Nathan covered her with a light blanket, then sat in the adjacent armchair, opening his laptop, but keeping his attention divided between his work and his wife. You don't have to babysit me, Emily murmured, already drifting toward sleep. I have Shadow. I know, Nathan replied softly. I'm just gathering data. When she woke an hour later, Nathan was still there, but his laptop was closed. Instead, he was simply watching her and Shadow, his expression contemplative. What kind of data were you gathering? Emily asked, pushing herself upright. Nathan's lips curved in a slight smile. The kind that can't be quantified. The way Shadow adjusts his position every time you move, even when you're sleeping. The way his breathing synchronizes with yours. The way he seems to know which days are harder than others. Emily studied her husband's face. And what conclusions have you drawn from this unquantifiable data? That I've been asking the wrong questions my entire life, Nathan answered, his voice low and serious. I've been so focused on what can be measured that I missed what matters most. The doorbell interrupted this moment of unexpected vulnerability. Emily's parents had arrived, bringing with them homemade chicken soup and barely concealed worry. You look tired, sweetheart, her mother observed, embracing Emily carefully. Margaret Wilson was a retired literature professor whose pragmatic compassion had shaped Emily's approach to life. Radiation fatigue, Emily explained, leading them into the living room where Shadow had taken up his customary position at her side. It's cumulative, but temporary. Emily's father, Robert, clasped Nathan's shoulder with unexpected emotion. How are you holding up, son? He asked quietly. Nathan hesitated, unused to such direct inquiries about his emotional state. I'm adapting, he replied honestly. That's all any of us can do, Robert nodded, seeming to understand the profound shift occurring within his analytical son-in-law. Lunch passed with gentle conversation, carefully avoiding cancer statistics or treatment complications. Instead, they discussed the Foundation's successful fundraiser, Margaret's garden plans, and, increasingly, Shadow's remarkable abilities. The researchers will be here soon, Nathan explained, checking his watch. They believe dogs like Shadow could revolutionize early cancer detection. Not just dogs like Shadow, Emily corrected gently. Shadow himself. He's unique. When the OHSU research team arrived, Dr. Markson and two assistants laden with equipment, Shadow observed their entrance with alert interest. The researchers had brought sealed samples, some from cancer patients, others from healthy controls, all anonymized and arranged in a specific testing protocol. We'll start with a basic scent identification exercise, Dr. Markson explained, arranging small containers in a line on the living room floor. If Shadow has natural detection abilities, we want to see how he indicates a positive sample. Nathan and Emily watched from the sofa as Dr. Markson's assistant led Shadow to the samples. The researchers had expected needing to provide basic training first, but Shadow approached the task with immediate understanding. Without hesitation, he moved directly to the third container, pressed his nose against it firmly, then sat down, looking back at Emily with expectant eyes. Dr. Markson checked her notes, eyebrows rising. That's extraordinary. That sample is indeed from a breast cancer patient. They ran the test 5 more times, rearranging the samples, adding additional controls. Shadow identified the positive samples with unwavering accuracy, never hesitating, never seeking approval before making his selection. In 20 years of research, Dr. Markson said, her clinical detachment giving way to genuine awe. I've never seen this level of natural ability. No training required. No reinforcement needed. He simply knows. Emily reached for Nathan's hand, finding unexpected tears in her eyes. He saved my life, she said simply. And he could save many more, Dr. Markson replied, her mind clearly racing with possibilities. With your permission, we'd like to include Shadow in our research program. It would involve regular sessions at our facility, working with different sample types to determine the full range of his abilities. Nathan looked at Emily, then at Shadow, who had returned to his place beside her. It would be a significant time commitment, he said cautiously. Emily's recovery has to remain our priority. Of course, Dr. Markson agreed. We can work around her treatment schedule, and Shadow would remain your family pet. We're simply asking to borrow his extraordinary nose for a few hours each week. After the researchers left, promising to send a formal proposal within days, Emily found Nathan sitting on the back patio, staring thoughtfully at their garden as dusk settled over Portland. Shadow lay at his feet, the two of them forming a tableau that would have been unimaginable months ago. What are you thinking? Emily asked, joining them. That life is fundamentally unpredictable, Nathan replied. All my systems, all my careful planning, none of it prepared me for what actually happened. None of it saved you. He looked down at Shadow. He did. Emily rested her head against Nathan's shoulder. We saved each other, I think. All 3 of us. 3 months after Emily's surgery, the summer heat washed over Portland in gentle waves. Their backyard had become a haven of recovery. A new lounge chair positioned perfectly beneath the maple tree, bird feeders attracting flashes of color, and a small water feature whose gentle burbling masked the urban sounds beyond their fence. These additions had appeared gradually, each one Nathan's response to Emily's offhand comments about finding peace in nature during her healing process. The radiation oncologist seemed pleased today, Emily remarked as she carefully tended the potted herbs that now lined their patio. Her movements were stronger, more fluid than they had been even a few weeks ago. The fatigue that had dominated her life was receding, replaced by a cautious energy that grew with each passing day. Nathan nodded from his position at the outdoor table, where spreadsheets and reports had given way to research papers on canine scent detection. Dr. Levin mentioned your tissue response is optimal. The statistical likelihood of recurrence has dropped significantly. Emily smiled at his phrasing. Some things hadn't changed. Nathan would always find comfort in data and probabilities. But the man who analyzed her medical reports was fundamentally different from the one who had once scheduled their lives with algorithmic precision. This Nathan regularly left work early for her appointments, had rearranged their home for maximum comfort during her recovery, and had developed a partnership with Shadow that sometimes left Emily feeling like she was witnessing a private conversation between species. Shadow and I have our third research session tomorrow, Nathan continued, glancing at the shepherd who lay nearby, attentive as always to Emily's movements. Dr. Markson wants to try different cancer types to test the limits of his detection abilities. The OHSU research project had evolved rapidly. Shadow's extraordinary accuracy had captured the attention of leading oncologists nationwide, and the preliminary paper documenting his abilities had been fast-tracked for publication in a prestigious medical journal. Nathan had thrown himself into the project with unexpected passion, absorbing medical terminology and research protocols with the same intensity he once applied to market analytics. "You're becoming quite the citizen scientist," Emily observed, settling into the chair opposite him. "The Nathan I married would have dismissed this as subjective nonsense 6 months ago." Nathan was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "The Nathan you married was wrong about many things," he finally said. "I measured life in certainties, controlled variables, predictable outcomes. I never understood that the most important things can't be quantified." Emily reached across the table to take his hand. "You've always cared deeply. You just expressed it differently." "Perhaps," he acknowledged. "But I missed so much, Emily. All those years focused on data points while the real story was happening right beside me." His eyes drifted to Shadow, who had risen to press his body against Emily's legs, a habit he maintained even as her health improved. "He understood what I couldn't see, that some connections transcend logic." Their conversation was interrupted by the chime of the doorbell. Shadow's ears perked forward, but he remained at Emily's side, his protective instinct still engaged despite her recovery. "That must be Diane," Emily said, rising carefully. "She wanted to discuss my gradual return to the foundation." Nathan's expression tightened slightly, a micro-reaction that Emily had become adept at reading. "Is it too soon?" he asked, the question heavy with unspoken concern. "Your immune system is still compromised from radiation." "I'm starting with just 2 half-days per week," Emily assured him. "All approved by Dr. Chun." Diane waited on the front porch, her bright smile dimming slightly as she assessed Emily with the anxious scrutiny that had become familiar from friends and colleagues. "You look stronger," she said, embracing Emily gently before following her inside. "I feel stronger," Emily confirmed, ready to rejoin the land of the productive. They settled in the living room, Shadow positioning himself at Emily's feet while Nathan brought iced tea before excusing himself to make conference calls from his home office, a consideration that would have been unthinkable in his previous routine-driven life. "We've missed you at the foundation," Diane said, opening her tablet to display the current project roster. "Though I've tried to keep everything running according to your systems." Emily smiled, feeling a rush of gratitude for this capable young woman who had shouldered her responsibilities without complaint. "From what I've heard, you've done more than maintain, you've excelled." They discussed upcoming events, donor relationships, and community partnerships. The familiar work filled Emily with purpose, a reminder of the life beyond recovery that awaited her. When Diane finally departed 2 hours later, Emily felt both energized and exhausted, a complex emotional state that characterized her healing journey. She found Nathan in the kitchen, preparing dinner with the methodical precision he brought to all tasks. Shadow lay nearby, his dark eyes tracking Nathan's movements with apparent interest. "I think he's hoping you'll drop something," Emily commented, leaning against the doorframe. Nathan glanced at the shepherd with unmistakable affection. "He knows I don't make culinary errors," he replied, the hint of humor in his voice another subtle change in the man she'd married. "How was your meeting?" "Productive. Energizing. Tiring," Emily answered honestly. "I'm ready to start re-engaging with the world, but I'm also aware of my limitations." Nathan nodded, his knife pausing over the vegetables he was dicing. "Recovery isn't linear. There will be setbacks among the progress. The analyst in you has been studying patient recovery patterns, hasn't he?" Emily teased gently. "The husband in me has been worried," Nathan corrected, setting down his knife to meet her gaze directly. "But I'm learning to balance concern with trust. You know your body better than anyone." That evening, as Portland's summer twilight lingered in shades of lavender and gold, they sat on their patio, sharing a meal that Nathan had prepared with the same attention to detail he once reserved for financial models. Shadow moved between them, his vigilance undiminished despite Emily's improving health. Dr. Markson mentioned a conference in Boston next month, Nathan said, refilling Emily's glass with the alcohol-free wine she preferred during recovery. "They want to present the preliminary findings on Shadow's detection abilities. She's invited us to attend." Emily studied her husband's expression, noting the subtle excitement beneath his composed exterior. "You want to go?" she observed. "Only if you're feeling strong enough," he qualified immediately. "Your health remains the priority." Emily smiled, reaching to touch his hand. "Nathan, it's okay to admit you're passionate about this research. It's been amazing watching you engage with something so unpredictable." "It's been transformative," he admitted quietly. "Working with Shadow, with the research team, I've had to reconsider fundamental assumptions about intelligence, about connection, about what constitutes meaningful data." He paused, his expression softening. "About what truly matters." As darkness settled over their garden, Shadow positioned himself alongside Emily's chair, his warm presence a constant reminder of the extraordinary bond that had developed between the three of them. Nathan watched them, his analytical mind still processing the improbability of their journey, how a dog's instinctive understanding had altered their trajectory, perhaps saved Emily's life, and in the process, changed Nathan himself in ways no algorithm could have predicted. "We should go to Boston," Emily decided, her fingers threading through Shadow's thick fur. "All three of us. It's time to share what Shadow has taught us." Nathan nodded, his expression reflective in the gathering darkness. "That some things can't be measured, only experienced," he said softly, "and that the most important discoveries often come when we least expect them." The conference hall in Boston's Heinz Convention Center buzzed with the controlled energy of scientific exchange. Hundreds of oncologists, researchers, and medical professionals moved between presentation rooms and poster sessions, their conversations a blend of technical terminology and cautious optimism about emerging treatments. In this sea of medical credentials, Emily, Nathan, and Shadow created an unusual ripple as they navigated the crowded corridors. Shadow, wearing his newly official therapy dog vest, complete with research program credentials, walked perfectly in step with Emily, his powerful body gently guiding her through the crowds with protective precision. The travel had been tiring, but Emily had insisted on attending the presentation. Seeing Nathan standing at the podium alongside Dr. Markson, speaking about canine cancer detection with passionate conviction, was worth any discomfort. "The data speaks for itself," Nathan was saying, his laser pointer highlighting a series of graphs that tracked Shadow's detection accuracy across different cancer types. In controlled double-blind trials, Shadow demonstrated 97% accuracy in identifying breast cancer samples, 94% for colorectal cancer, and 91% for lung cancer, all without specific training protocols. From her seat in the front row, Emily felt a surge of pride watching her husband. The Nathan who had once dismissed anything that couldn't be quantified was now fielding questions about intuitive intelligence and cross-species communication with thoughtful nuance. When an audience member expressed skepticism about the practical applications, Nathan's response was measured but resolute. "6 months ago, I would have shared your doubts," he acknowledged. "As a data analyst, I built my career on measurable, replicable results. But Shadow's abilities, while still being scientifically documented, remind us that we haven't yet developed instruments sensitive enough to detect what some animals can naturally perceive. The limitation isn't in their abilities, but in our understanding. At the mention of his name, Shadow's ears twitched, but he remained steadfastly beside Emily, his dark eyes occasionally scanning the crowd as if assessing potential threats to her still recovering body. During the demonstration portion of the presentation, Shadow moved to the stage with dignified purpose. The research team had prepared anonymized samples, some from cancer patients, others from healthy controls. Without hesitation, Shadow identified each positive sample with the same certainty he had shown that first day in their living room, sitting beside each cancer sample and looking back at Emily with those knowing eyes. The audience's skepticism transformed into stunned silence, then erupted in applause as the samples were verified one by one. In the world of oncology, where early detection remained the holy grail of treatment success, Shadow's abilities represented a breakthrough that transcended conventional medical technology. Afterward, as attendees crowded around Nathan and Dr. Markson with questions and business cards, Emily found a quiet corner of the reception area. The excitement of the presentation had drained her limited energy reserves, and Shadow seemed to sense her fatigue, pressing closer to her side. "There you are," came Nathan's voice as he appeared with 2 glasses of water, having extricated himself from the crowd of interested researchers. "You should be resting at the hotel. The afternoon session doesn't start for 3 hours." Emily accepted the water gratefully. "And miss your breakthrough into medical academia? Not a chance." She studied her husband's face, noting the healthy flush of excitement in his cheeks. "You were amazing up there, Nathan. So passionate, so articulate about Shadow's abilities." Nathan sat beside her, his hand automatically reaching to stroke Shadow's head. "It's easy to be passionate about something that changed your life," he said quietly. "That changed everything." A young oncologist approached them hesitantly, her conference badge identifying her as Dr. Sarah Patel from Memorial Sloan Kettering. "Excuse me," she began, her eyes moving between Nathan, Emily, and Shadow. "I was deeply moved by your presentation. My lab has been exploring early detection methods for pancreatic cancer, where early identification is particularly crucial for survival rates. I wonder if Shadow might be able to help." Emily finished for her, recognizing the hope in the young doctor's eyes. Dr. Patel nodded. "We have grant funding for novel detection approaches. What you've demonstrated today could potentially save thousands of lives if we can develop a systematic application." Nathan exchanged a glance with Emily, a wordless communication that had developed between them throughout her illness, a new language of understanding that required no analytics or explanation. "We'd be honored to discuss collaboration," Nathan replied, reaching for Emily's hand. "Though we need to work around my wife's ongoing recovery schedule." That evening, in their hotel room overlooking Boston Harbor, Emily curled on the bed with Shadow stretched protectively beside her while Nathan made tea using the electric kettle he'd insisted on bringing from home. 5 different research centers want to work with Shadow, he marveled, shaking his head slightly. Dr. Markson is already talking about establishing a formal canine detection program with Shadow as the prototype. Emily smiled, watching the subtle shifts in her husband's expression, the animation that now softened his once rigidly controlled features when he spoke about Shadow's abilities. "What about your job?" she asked gently. "Data analysis for Westbrook Financial isn't exactly aligned with canine cancer detection research." Nathan was quiet for a moment, stirring her tea with the methodical precision that remained fundamental to his nature. "I've been thinking about that," he admitted. "I've accumulated significant leave time. Perhaps a sabbatical, initially. And then, Emily prompted when he paused. "And then perhaps a recalculation of priorities," he finished, bringing her the perfectly prepared tea, honey and lemon in precise proportions. "My skills in statistical analysis and research design would transfer well to this field. Dr. Markson has already hinted at potential research positions within the program." Emily studied her husband's face, seeing the subtle transformation that had occurred over the past 6 months, not just in his priorities and perspectives, but in the very way he engaged with the world. The rigid lines around his mouth had softened. His eyes, once focused primarily on screens and reports, now regularly sought connection with her, with Shadow, with the living relationships that had become central to his recalibrated life. "You're considering a career change," she observed. Not a question, but a recognition. Nathan nodded slowly. 6 months ago, the idea would have been unthinkable. My 5-year career plan was meticulously plotted. But now, he looked at Shadow, who had lifted his head at their conversation, those intelligent eyes moving between them. "Now I understand that the most meaningful work might be something I never calculated for." Emily reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Life beyond the spreadsheet." "Life because of him," Nathan corrected, nodding toward Shadow. "Because he saw what I couldn't. Because he taught me that some connections don't need analysis. They just need to be honored." As Boston's lights reflected across the harbor waters outside their window, Emily thought about the journey that had brought them here. Not just the physical distance from Portland to Boston, but the emotional evolution from Nathan's controlled existence to this moment of open possibility. The cancer had changed them both, as life-threatening illness always does. But the true transformation had come through Shadow, the silent guardian whose instinctive understanding had first saved Emily's life and then, somehow, had awakened in Nathan a capacity for connection that no algorithm could have predicted. "Whatever you decide," Emily said softly, "we'll face it together. All 3 of us." Nathan nodded, his expression serene in a way she had never seen before her diagnosis. He reached to stroke Shadow's head, the gesture now as natural to him as checking data points had once been. "I've spent my career analyzing probabilities, calculating risks, predicting outcomes," he reflected. "But Shadow taught me the most important equation of all, that love multiplies when it's shared. It's the only calculation that truly matters." Outside their window, the Boston skyline glittered against the night sky, each light representing lives and stories unknown to them. And in thousands of those homes, perhaps, were other guardians like Shadow, ordinary angels whose extraordinary intuition might one day be understood through the research they were helping to pioneer. Shadow shifted position to place his head on Emily's lap, his dark eyes holding hers with that same knowing look that had first alerted her to the cancer growing within her body. Now, as her healing continued, the shepherd's vigilance remained, not from fear, but from the pure, devoted connection that transcended species, transcended logic, transcended even the boundaries of spoken language. In the peaceful silence of their hotel room, with Boston's lights twinkling beyond the window and Shadow's warm weight against her healing body, Emily watched Nathan scrolling through research papers on his tablet, still the meticulous analyst, but now guided by something beyond pure logic. The man who had once found security in statistical certainty had discovered a deeper truth, that the most important connections in life could never be plotted on a graph or captured in an equation. They were written instead in the language of love, loyalty, and unwavering presence, a language that Shadow had spoken all along, waiting patiently for his humans to learn how to listen. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and if you've watched this far, comment "I watched to the end" and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears in the end screen. It's very exciting.